Hello, everyone. My name is Sherry Paula Watkins, and as Executive Director of North Carolina Humanities, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's North Carolina Reads Book Club discussion of American Refuge, True Stories of the Refugee Experience with Diya Abdo and Dr. Omar Ali. This is our third book discussion in our 2024 North Carolina Reads series, and we are so glad you are here. We started North Carolina Reads in 2022 because at North Carolina Humanities, we believe in the power of books, reading, and stories. Now in its third year, North Carolina Reads features 5 books that explore issues of racial, social, and gender equity in the history and culture of North Carolina. We hope that tonight you feel connected to our guest speakers and each other and are inspired to think about and empathize with the stories and experiences of others. Thank you again for being here this evening. Now it is my pleasure to turn the event over to Melissa Giblin, Director of the North Carolina Center for the Book, to finish introductions. Melissa?
Thank you so much, Sherry Paula. As Sherry Paula said, my name is Melissa Giblin, and I am so excited to begin this evening's conversation. I will be your moderator for this evening's event, and we're just very excited to have you all here. So as a nonpartisan statewide nonprofit and as North Carolina's affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities, our mission at NC Humanities is to connect North Carolinians with cultural experiences that spur dialogue, deepen human connections, and inspire community. This evening features a moderated discussion on American Refuge, True Stories of the Refugee Experience, which is our 2024 North Carolina Reads selection for April. As a note about this evening's program, North Carolina Reads books are intended for readers 18 and over, and this program contains content that may be sensitive to some. We would like to acknowledge the National Endowment for the Humanities, the State Library of North Carolina, and McGuire Woods for their sponsorship support of this year's program. Please note any views, findings, conclusions, opinions, or recommendations expressed by our partners and participants do not necessarily represent those of NC Humanities or the National Endowment for the Humanities. Before we begin, we will briefly discuss a few housekeeping points for this evening's event and how to engage with us. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available after the live session on our YouTube channel. All 5 of the 2024 North Carolina Reads book events will be available on our YouTube channel. We encourage you to subscribe to that channel at NC Humanities so that you can get all of the updates and notifications on when those programs are available. We would love to hear from you during today's event. If you have a question, please send it through the Q&A tab. We will have a question and answer period towards the end of the program. Closed captions are available by clicking on the CC button at the bottom of your screen. We encourage you to share your experience on social media by tagging at NC Humanities on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And now to introduce our speakers for tonight's discussion. Diya Abdo is the Lincoln Financial Professor of English at Guilford College and founder and director of Every Campus a Refuge, ECAR. ECAR mobilizes colleges and universities to host refugees on campus grounds and support them in their resettlement. She recently received an Emerson Collective Fellowship to produce an oral history of ECAR. She lives in Greensboro, North Carolina, with her partner and 2 daughters. Dr. Omar Ali is Dean of Lloyd International Honors College at UNC Greensboro. A world historian with a focus on the African diaspora, he graduated from the London School of Economics and Political Science and received his PhD in history from Columbia University. In 2016, he was named Carnegie Foundation North Carolina Professor of the Year, and in 2021, he was contacted by the Ambassador of France to the United States and made Chevalier dans l'Ordre des Palmes Académiques Knight by the French government for his work with teachers around the world. Born in Lima, Peru, to a South American mother and a South Asian father, he is the author of 7 books on world history. He and his little family moved to Greensboro in 2010. So welcome, Diya and Omar. We're so excited to have you here this evening.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you so much for having us. And so great to see so many people from all across North Carolina on the call. That's wonderful.
Yes, it is. So we'll jump right into our discussion questions. And this first one will be for you, Diya, and Omar, please add in as you like. So for those who have not yet read the book or may need a refresher, please briefly tell our audience what the book is about. And to help contextualize our understanding, Diya, can you explain more about the definitions you provide at the end of the book about refugees?
Yes, absolutely. First, I want to say thank you so much to the North Carolina Humanities for selecting my book as one of this year's reads. The other books are wonderful, and it's an honor to be counted among them. Grateful to you, Melissa, and to everyone at NC Humanities, and of course to Omar for joining me today in this conversation. To be able to tell you about the book, which is broadly about refugees and the refugee experience, I think I have to also tell you a little bit about myself. And because so much of why the book came about was because of my own personal experience and then professional experience here in the United States. So I'm Palestinian. I was born to Palestinian refugee parents and grandparents who were displaced to Jordan in 1967. And I was born, in Jordan and raised there, and very much grew up on the stories of my grandmother about Palestine and how much she loved Palestine, how much she missed Palestine. And really, so I grew up understanding that the refugee experience meant endless yearning. It meant a constant desire to be elsewhere, to be back at home. Unfortunately, my grandmother passed away having never returned to Palestine, but it was certainly her dying wish to go back home. So for me, the refugee experience has always meant to be out of place and to one day, hopefully, be able to return to your home country. I came to the US as an international student on an F1 visa and then stayed as an immigrant. And so this experience of a newcomer to the United States is also something that marks my journey here in this country. So it's both of those experiences of growing up as a second-generation refugee and then coming here as a newcomer that I think inform or undergird the book itself and my interest in the refugee question. In 2015, I was a professor, I still am, at Guilford College, here in Greensboro, North Carolina, which Guilford is a beautiful, wonderful, small Quaker school, which is highly relevant to this effort of every campus a refuge. In 2015, I was watching, like a lot of people, with horror, what was happening to Syrian refugees, and I felt deeply connected to Syrian refugees because we were from the same part of the world. They looked like me, they looked like my family. I sort of understood what they were experiencing. And I heard Pope Francis at the time call on every parish in Europe to host a refugee family. I was really moved by that call on a small community to do the work of welcome. And so I proposed that idea to our university or college president, and she said yes. And so we started in 2015 this initiative called Every Campus a Refuge, where we host refugee families on our campus. It's in faculty housing, and the campus group supports them in their resettlement and integration. Since 2015, we've hosted over 90 refugees. We just recently welcomed a family of 3, which is wonderful. The book is the stories of several individuals who have participated in this program, Every Campus a Refuge. It's also the story of my mother and my grandmother, but this is very much a Greensboro story. What has happened to those folks before they came to Greensboro, and what has their life been like since they arrived? The book contains the stories of 6 folks, including the artist who created the cover of my book, and I hope we get a chance to talk about it. But yep, his name is Ali Al-Khazraji. He's from Iraq, and he's an artist and a calligraphist who escaped 2 assassination attempts and made it here a week before the Muslim ban with his family in 2017. In order to talk about refugees, and that's the reason that last chapter exists, I found that over the years, there's a lot of confusion about these terms that we use that are highly politicized. Refugee, immigrant, migrant, undocumented, documented, expatriate. These are all people on the move. These are all people who have had to move for one reason or another, whether it's to survive or thrive. And of course, people should be able to move, right? That's why the term, illegal is so frustrating, because humans cannot be illegal, right? So really the last chapter allows us to deconflate the term so that we can understand exactly what we mean when we say refugee. The term refugee describes a very particular case, a very particular kind of person on the move. This is a person who has had to cross a border because they're escaping, they're fleeing danger, persecution, death. They are seeking safety and security. And so they present themselves as they cross a border to, whether it's the UN, UNHCR, or the authorities or the local government, to ask for refuge. So it's really important to be able to sort of disentangle the terms from each other while being very clear that we should support all human beings who desire to move and need to move to protect themselves and their family, and also to thrive.
Thank you so much, Diya, for that explanation. And Omar, do you have anything you'd like to add to round out the contextualization for people on the move, or anything that Diya has said?
Yeah, I think that the terms, and we'll probably get to this, but I think it's really important to distinguish migrants from refugees, the forced nature of people who are displaced. But we'll have more time to talk about these things, but eager to go through the other questions.
Wonderful. Well, I'll start with you, Omar, for the second one. For chapter 3, what do those stories show about why refugees leave their home country, often when they don't intend to or want to leave?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about the setting up of the chapter with anybody can become a refugee. And then at the end, near the end of the chapter, anybody can become a refugee, stated again. Most refugees never imagined that they would one day be refugees. And for me, I mean, to me, the thing that's striking about the book is sort of the intimacy of these stories. You get in there because I think that what has happened is that people have been dehumanized and just are made into numbers, or these sort of these bodies without specificity of their own, stories and who they are. But I think one of the things that struck me was that even people who are living in ongoing violence, ongoing war, don't necessarily see themselves becoming refugees. And so it's almost surprising for those of us who've had the privilege of not living in those types of conditions to not have to, think about that, but in a very different way. But it tells me is that everything is really quite relative, and things become normalized. And so even a person who's living in a state of war, ongoing war, violence, may not see themselves becoming this displaced person, because they're leaving everything they know behind, even if that includes the normalization of the violence and war.
Yeah, do you want to add on to chapter 3 in capturing those stories about why refugees leave their home country, often when they don't intend or want to leave?
Yeah, thank you. So the very definition, there's a very clear definition of the term refugee, and that was, it happened as a result of the mass exodus of people during World War II. So in 1951, the Geneva Convention established the UNHCR, which is the United Nations Refugee Agency, to be able to tackle with this just so many people forcibly displaced from their home. And so in chapter 3, you meet these individuals, Blaze, Ali, Marwa, Fehmi, my grandmother, Riri, Chaps. These are all individuals who could no longer stay where they are because their life was in danger and their family's life was in danger. At the opening of the book, I say, to become a refugee is to seek to solve the problem of death, right? That's what plagues, refugees. That's why they have to escape. And the definition of a refugee is sort of very clear. It's someone who is unable to return to their country of origin because they're being persecuted for one of 5 reasons: nationality, race, religion, political opinion, or membership in a social group. What's really interesting about this is that there are so many other ways in which people can be forcibly displaced, are forcibly displaced, whether it's climate or gangs or poverty or the plundering of resources, but they're not eligible for that refugee status because it has to be tied to a very particular cause. So in the book, for example, Chaps is a gay man who has to escape Uganda to nearby Kenya and ends up living in a refugee camp. In the case of Mfihmi, they are escaping because of the civil war and because of the regime's cruel actions in their village. For my grandmother, it's because they happen to be visiting, and the sort of the occupation makes it impossible for them to go back. For others like Blaze, it's witnessing something that puts his family and his life in danger and then having to leave. So they have to leave. They never want to leave. I think that's so important to remember that refugees never want to leave their home. They are escaping really death and terrorism, which is so important to, again, to keep remembering, because there's so many myths about refugees, and one of them is, that they're scary, that they're dangerous, right? That's the narrative that we hear. And so it's really important to keep reminding people that it's the exact opposite, that a person who has been given that status of refugee is someone who has proven that they cannot go back because their life is in danger. Yeah.
Thank you. And when you were recording those stories for chapter 3 and for the book, was there hesitancy for people to talk with you about their experiences, or how did they relate those very trying experiences to you?
Thank you. That's such a great question. I think from an ethical perspective too, it's really important. And I want to talk a little bit about my process. So when we started in 2015, I met very quickly Chaps. Chaps was our first guest. He came in January of 2016. And then I met Fehmi and her family. They came in March of 2016. And then I met Ali and Marwa. They came in 2017. And then Blaze. So I knew these individuals, and of course I knew my mother and grandmother, family members, but I knew these individuals really as friends, right? These were folks who I have developed and had developed deep relationships with, that were governed certainly by the nature of the work, right? It was sort of every campus a refuge, especially in the case of Chaps and Blaze and Fehmi and Riri, who was a student at Guildford College and was supporting with the effort, but had come as a child refugee herself and is Burmese. And so all of these stories were actually told to me just in the course of organic conversations. In fact, I think I mentioned that in the case of Fehmi, it happened that I was visiting her one day and had asked a very simple question, and then she told me the story. That was the response to, how are you doing? And it's because I say in the book, one of the things that refugees have to do to prove that they are seeking safety is they have to tell the story to many people. They have to tell the story to the guard that, meets them at the border, to the UNHCR, to the resettlement agency. They have to tell that story over and over again, and it has to be unchanging. So refugees, one of the most important pieces of that definition is a well-founded fear of persecution. In other words, they have to constantly prove over and over again, this is what happened to me, and it cannot change that story. So I think that's the story that Fehmi has been used to telling. So when I was asked to write this book, I knew that I had stories, but I couldn't share those stories because those stories were shared with me in confidence, right? They were told to me in the context of a living room over tea, or in a car when I was taking someone to DSS, or over a meal. And so when I was asked to write this book, I thought, well, let me reach out to a few folks and see if they're interested in sharing their stories. And there were others, but these were the folks who wanted to share their story. And so in order to capture those stories, we then did a formal interview. So I didn't write anything from memory. It was a formal interview, including my mother. My grandmother, of course, had passed away, but my mother, bring her my phone and I asked very generic questions because I really was careful, really did not want to re-traumatize or trigger any painful memories. So I asked questions like, can you tell me about your childhood? Or can you tell me about Uganda? Or can you tell me about Palestine? Can you tell me about Greensboro? Just sort of so people can share whatever they wanted to share and I didn't ask specific questions like, why did you become a refugee? In fact, one of the things we train our volunteers to do at every campus of refuge is never to ask that question, because it can be very painful for someone to have to say that again. What was clear to me in the process of those interviews, two things emerged that were really interesting. In a few cases, someone would say to me, I know you know this, but you can't say it in the book. And that cemented for me the importance of actually conducting the work this way. In other words, that people have things that they share with you as a friend that are secret and sacred. They're not meant for consumption by other people. And so the fact that, Blaze would say, or Chaps would, or Marwa would say, I know you know this that I'm going to say right now, but you can't say it in the book. And of course I didn't, was really important. But the other thing that was really interesting was when I interviewed my mother. And I don't know what about it. I'm sort of constantly mulling over that piece of it in that moment. When I was interviewing my mother, she told me things that she had never told me before. So that story about my mother as a teenager living in Jordan in the 70s, early 70s, and their apartment being bombed, and their Jordanian landlord sheltering them from, other Jordanians who were there. So there was a conflict. I never knew that story. And it was so interesting to me that the process of the formal interview probably validated her experience. Like, it made her want to share it. And I just thought that, like, how many things don't we know about our parents and their lives? And it made me sad that there are probably things that our parents don't tell us, our grandparents don't tell us. And maybe because they feel it's not important, maybe because they feel that, like, who cares? And I think in that moment of formally interviewing her, she felt like I cared, and that somebody would be interested in hearing that story. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that about your process. That is quite revealing. And I feel like that came up on our last conversation as well, about women in World War II and how they never talked about their experiences. They just didn't, and their daughters didn't hear about it. Their children didn't hear about it. They did all of these things and never spoke of it really again. So that seems to be more of a universal experience than we may recognize. But Omar, before we move to the next question, just any other thoughts on chapter 3 and those stories? Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, I actually wanted to reflect back on what Diya was saying about the unknown stories, because I think there are many, many stories out there, and there's a spectrum of experiences. And I was wondering, like, actually, I had not really thought about this, but I ask my students sometimes to talk to older members of their family. But I think that we almost like we should formally try to interview our relatives, whatever our background is, because I think that we would generate new conversations and also intimacy. And I think the validating process is very interesting, what you're saying, that it opened up some possibilities. Yeah.
And that's a great segue into our next question, which gets into a little bit more of generational, how refugee situations can become generational over time. So Diya, in the book, it's noted that less than 1% of the world's refugees are resettled, but instead remain in refugee camps. So what are the experiences? What is daily life like for those living in refugee camps? And how does that become, in a number of instances, a generational situation? So yeah, I'll throw that to you, and then we'll get to Omar.
Yeah, I like to use sort of what happened to Palestinians as an example. I like to say my family was really lucky. They happened to cross a very particular border. Like many other Palestinians, landed in Jordan. And because they ended up in Jordan, due to the course of history and politics and things like that, they were able to achieve integration. And integration means citizenship, right? So when we talk about refugees integrating, what that means is that they are able to achieve access and rights. They become citizens of the country in which they're integrated. Mm-hmm. Many refugees do not achieve integration. What they achieve is de facto integration, which means you're kind of living, you're working under the table, you don't have citizenship, you might not even have documentation. Essentially, you're stateless. This happened to many Palestinians who crossed different borders and ended up in Syria and in Lebanon, where to this day, 77 years later, they are, their children and grandchildren are living in protracted displacement. Again, with incredible challenges to pursuing an education or getting a job, right? So what is that without citizen? You can't travel. Many refugees don't necessarily end up living in refugee camps where life is heavily, heavily surveilled. So, thinking of Dadaab and Kakuma, in Chap's story, for example, he had to find a way to get out of Kakuma where he was because he didn't have the right paperwork. And so it's a sort of a harrowing journey, very suspenseful, of how he manages to get out of the camp to get to Nairobi. For many refugees who are living in true, like actual refugee camps, kind of like warehouses, essentially, they're heavily surveilled. It's like a detention. It's like detention, right? But for many other refugees who are living in cities and urban situations, they're really just invisible, hyper visible, but also invisible in the sense that, again, they don't have access, they don't have rights. They're trying to get whatever jobs they can. It is really just a matter of survival. And I think that's just kind of continually shocking to me that there are 36 million individuals who are eligible to go to another country and achieve resettlement, which is what happens to refugees who come to the United States. They come here under the resettlement program where they can become citizens of this country. Very important to remember that when refugees hit the tarmac in the United States, they are effectively residents. They are our newest Americans. The folks who come to Greensboro are our newest North Carolinians. A year after their arrival, they get a green card that's backdated to the day of their arrival, and 5 years in, they're eligible to become citizens. And that's so important, that's so crucial. But out of the 36 million people in the world who are eligible for that, less than 1% will ever achieve that. That means that so many millions will continue to live in camps, urban or rural, warehouse camps, where what I've described really is what's happening. They're surviving, but they don't have access. They don't have rights. They're not integrating.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Omar, the same question to you, your thoughts on what Diya has said and the experiences of those living that daily life that sometimes often moves into kind of a generational pattern for folks.
Yeah, actually, I want to ask Diya for some help around thinking about something, which is that, my own work looks at the global African diaspora, and a lot of the movement has forced migration of people who've been enslaved. And I want to be careful about not mixing categories up because there's specificity to refugees as you're describing. But it did make me think, Diya, about like groups of people like these who are African descended peoples living in South Asia whose four parents had been enslaved and taken over, and they live in a state not unlike refugees. They don't really have full citizenship, nominal, but in terms of the sort of the block sort of access to loans, to education, and other things. And there's been some movements to change that, but do you think of in some ways the enslavement of people? And we know that there's forced the sex trafficking industry has millions of people that are involved, and am I mixing apples and oranges? How do you think about that distinction?
Thank you. So I mean, those folks have been forcibly moved, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we're thinking about them. I mean, if we're talking too about the indigenous people in this country and
Yeah.
The African diaspora, that is a forced migration. I mean, I think what's helpful for me is thinking kind of about the political landscape right now in terms of how refugee is being defined, and hopefully constantly working to advocate for additional ways in which we can expand protection for individuals who do not fall neatly under those categories, right? So currently, the refugee definition by the UNHCR and the Geneva Convention, which allows certain individuals to be able to access citizenship and rights, is pretty restrictive, right? It has to do with, again, political opinion, race, but you have to prove your case. How do you prove your case when you're generations in? What does that even look like?
Right.
Who do you talk to? Does your country even exist anymore? What if you're moving because of climate disasters? So I think we have to develop nationally, internationally, and think intersectionally about what it means to protect individuals who have they're generations in from, their grandmothers or their grandfathers who have been moved. It really is just about, well, not just, but it is very important to continue to advocate for increased protection for individuals and increased expansion of understanding forced migration and why it happens. At the moment, I think the UNHCR definition is pretty restrictive.
Yeah.
So we've touched on a little bit on obstacles that refugees face when leaving their home country. And we can expand on that a little bit more as you would like. But I also want to talk about opportunities that refugees have when they arrive in their new home country, and specifically here in North Carolina. And we can talk about Greensboro and other cities that are seeing refugee populations. And so what obstacles do refugees face, and what opportunities do they have, and what are they bringing to their new communities as new Americans? So Diya, if you'd like to start, or Omar.
Omar, do you want to start?
Oh, I think you are the expert on this.
Oh, I'm not sure, but I appreciate that.
Yeah.
So the question is about both obstacles and opportunities, and I think it's good to talk about them because we want to make sure that the fullness of that experience is represented. When we're talking about refugees arriving to this country, it really, and I think there's a point in the book where I describe how the folks who have come here have felt about it. They use the term newborn. It really is like you're starting from scratch. You're starting completely afresh. Like all of a sudden you're in a new place, but the responsibilities that are assigned to you are not commensurate with that newness, right? So you come to a country, you might be coming from a refugee camp, you might not, depending. So for example, Ali and Marwa, their case is what's called special immigrant visa. And it's a kind of situation like refugee situation where the person is like Afghan interpreters and translators, someone who are very large. That's why when we have one of the largest Montagnard populations here is because we settle so many Montagnards and large Vietnamese population. Those are folks who have been allies of the U.S. government or have somehow worked with the U.S. government or the U.S. military in their country, which that puts them in danger. So folks come here, after, I think, a very traumatic experience, because we just have to remember the definition of a refugee is someone who is unable to return to their country of origin because of a well-founded fear of persecution. So it's sort of the baseline, the given that they are escaping violence, and that's a traumatic experience. And then you come here and it's so fresh. Like this country is new. Your English proficiency could vary. You might be incredibly proficient. You might not be proficient. You might have many children. You might have no children. It really is just depends. You might have a very high level of education. You might not. So what we do know, however, is regardless of this diversity, you come to a place that is entirely new to you, and then you are expected by the resettlement program in this country to achieve self-sufficiency and financial independence 90 days after you arrive. So that's the expectation. That's kind of the newness. It's so new. And then you have to become self-sufficient regardless of language proficiency, how many kids you need to look after. The resettlement program also provides individuals with a modest stipend of $1,200. So just financially too, it's kind of just very challenging to begin your life anew with that kind of burden, that kind of expectation to be able to handle everything 3 months after you get here with such a modest one-time allowance. That allowance is given to each member in the family. But if you're a single person, it's so hard. I mean, just trying to think about Chaps and Blaze, who had to start fresh with $1,200. However, the opportunities, and you can certainly hear this, when you talk to Chaps and you talk to Blaze, they feel like they can plan for their lives. That's what Chaps says. I can have a plan for my life now. Even if it's hard, I can hope for my life. It's very hard to plan for your life when you're living in a refugee camp, and that's it. Like the parameters of your life are the camp. You can't even exit the camp. For the elders, I will say that the opportunity is for their children. That emerges as a theme over and over again. I want to be back home. I want to be with people who are like me. I'm here for my kids, right? I'm here for my child who can now go to school and he'll go to college and he'll be a doctor, right? So it's very much about, their children. And for the young folks, it really is about sort of the plan and the hope. I want to tell, and probably people on this call know that Greensboro and North Carolina is a leader in refugee resettlement in the United States. So we resettle 4% of refugees who come to this country annually. And because of that, because of how long we've been doing it in Greensboro, we've developed a really robust infrastructure for refugee support because of the refugee communities that have ended up here and that have built that infrastructure. They've created organizations like the Montagnard Dega Association or the Sudan House or the Center for North Carolinians. I mean, there's just, former refugees, our newest North Carolinians have really created wonderful opportunities for integration and for support for newcomer communities that have come after them. Yeah.
I'll just add one little thing. The impact of Greensboro being a site, a refugee settlement site, is expressed actually in the public school system. Several years ago, they did a survey, and in our public school system in Guilford County actually has almost had 150 languages that were spoken in it, which is unbelievable given the size of our population. But I was also struck by your statistic of that about 4% of all refugees come to Greensboro, North Carolina, this area. I mean, this is in comparison to New York City. It's an incredible amount. And I think I think that we'll talk about this, but the enriching experience for the community to have people who come from so many different backgrounds, to me, is one of the extraordinary things about where we live.
And if I can add too, because I saw the question that wasn't a question, but it was someone who works in a refugee resettlement agency, that we are also really here in Greensboro. We have 2 refugee resettlement agencies, Church World Services, Greensboro, CWS Greensboro, African Services Coalition. There is so much work that the resettlement agencies do against a system that is very challenging to operate within, right? So when you hear about, again, the 90 days expectation for self-sufficiency, the limited stipend, the fact that refugees have to pay back their plane ticket 6 months after they arrive, I mean, they can pay it slowly, but that's still such a burden for people to carry. I think the resettlement agencies are doing incredible work within, significant restrictions.
Yeah. Are there other cities in North Carolina? We talked about Greensboro a lot. Are there other cities that see this influx of refugee populations that you've worked with, Diya, or that you're familiar with, Omar? Or is Greensboro really a very special and unique city for this?
I think Greensboro is special because
Yeah.
I'm in Greensboro. But yes, we do. Yeah. Go ahead, Omar.
Well, there was actually an interesting question about, was that 4% before ECAR was started, or is it afterwards?
Oh yeah, no, definitely before. I mean, ECAR is the way ECAR operates is that we support the folks who come to Greensboro, are already coming to Greensboro. I think that's such a great question, because the idea is that the more you mobilize higher education institutions to do this, the more we build our capacity for welcome.
Mm-hmm.
There are 4,000 colleges and universities in this country.
Mm-hmm.
I like to think if each one of them hosted a refugee family one at a time, imagine how many more we can host, how many more we can welcome. So there is, I believe, catalyzing the higher education sector could lead to greater welcome. But at the moment, every campus of refuge operates, in the universities across the country, really to support the refugees that are already coming to a city. But yeah, I mean, Charlotte, Raleigh, I saw somebody from New Bern on the call. New Bern has a large refugee community, which is wonderful. I wonder if they'll just sort of, if they have any information about New Bern. But I think there's a large Burmese community in New Bern. So, I mean, I think Greensboro is unique in some ways. One of the things that we have here, and maybe they have them in other places in North Carolina, and if somebody knows in the chat, let me know. But I do know that when I visit a lot of other cities across this country, really what I'm trying to do is galvanize other universities to do this, as you can imagine. And we talk about the infrastructure that they have in their cities, and it's obviously something that is slowly being built, which is wonderful. But one of the things that we have here in Greensboro is the newcomer school. So we have two newcomer schools, and these are public schools in Greensboro that are dedicated to the transitional year of refugee children once they arrive, which is remarkable, and not something you see in a lot of other places. It's truly just a wonderful resource to have in this welcoming infrastructure that Greensboro is building.
Omar, any thoughts on that?
No, it's great.
I want to lean into something that you said earlier and talk about enrichment. We showed the beautiful cover of the book that was done by one of the refugees. So let's talk about the enrichment and the skills and the rich culture and heritage that refugees bring to the communities that they settle in. So Omar, if you want to start with that.
Well, maybe it's because it's around dinner time, but I was thinking about cuisine. Like, I mean, there's just that. I mean, for our size city, we do have quite a range, but there's also, all of the. We have this market called Super G, and it's a place that a lot of refugee communities and people just from different parts of the world really enjoy, because there's such a range. But there's like El Mercadito. There's a lot of different stores in Greensboro that make it accessible for everybody to enjoy different kinds of foods, and and so that's one way. I think there is also, I know that musically there's a lot. One of my colleagues at UNCG is an ethnomusicologist, Gavin Douglas, and I know that he's benefited by being in contact with people from many different refugee communities and the music. And we host here the North Carolina Folk Festival. So there's ways of giving public expression to those musical forms. So cuisine, in terms of just in some ways also like how people look. You go around Greensboro and you see people who are dressed in ways that they may have dressed back at home, or it's refined. It's in some aspects. So visually, audibly, in terms of our taste, these are all enriching things for our communities as a whole. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you for sharing that, Diya.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I think that's one of the reasons that I love raising my kids here. It is really, truly international, right? I think I was asked a question once about what is not necessarily an interesting thing about Greensboro, but something that's really important about Greensboro. And I think of LeBauer Park. Like, it's not, I'm not going to say to someone, you need to come to Greensboro and see LeBauer Park. That's not what I would ever say. But LeBauer Park to me is kind of a representation of what Greensboro is. I take my kids down to the park, and there's all colors, all races, all religions, all languages. My kids don't think it's weird at all that, there's Eid, and then there's Ramadan, and then there's this festival and that. I mean, it's just, they're exposed to the multiplicity and the diversity that we have over the years really developed in Greensboro. And to, Omar's point, I'm always just, again, so proud when I go places and they're like, well, in Greensboro, we have an Ethiopian restaurant. And we have a Laotian restaurant, like different variations of Korean food. It's not just like the Korean restaurant or the Chinese restaurant. There's so many languages that you can take the test in at the DMV. People underestimate that. Like one of our ECAR chapters is Oklahoma State University, and they had not, and another one is Washington State, which is in Pullman, Washington. And they've never done refugee resettlement before. This was the first time that they've done refugee resettlement. And they're like, well, I mean, at the DMV, it's like just English. I'm like, well, it won't be for long. It won't be for long. And that's like the kind of access and the kind of change that is irrevocable. Like it changes what a city looks like, who's going to school, what languages are your interpreters speaking, what languages can you take the driver's test in at the DMV? I mean, that's just so crucial about the nature of a place. And it changes fundamentally like who we are for generations, which I think is remarkable. But the other thing that I put in my book that I think is, some people need to hear, because there's another myth about refugees, which is that they take away our resources, which is really harmful rhetoric to engage in, and false. So a study by the American Immigration Council that was published in June of last year shows that refugees have contributed, in 2019, this is the time that the study was covering, 68 billion in spending power. I don't know, 25 billion in taxes that they contribute to the workforce at larger percentages than local born folks. So it's the opposite. Refugees contribute to the economy in really remarkable ways.
Yeah, thank you. And you talked about that in your book a little, or a lot, Diya, I should say, with the folks who got jobs, right? We talked about economic self-sufficiency after that, 90-day period and things like that. But how about integrating into the workforce in Greensboro, right? We talked about, I think there was one in particular who worked at the Tyson plant, and I feel like I saw that in the chat somewhere. They were referencing the Tyson plant. So any thoughts or comments on how refugees find their way into the workplace?
Yeah, absolutely. So we go back to this question of 90 days. What does it mean when someone says to you, really the expectation is that you become financially independent in 90 days? What usually that means is that you have to accept the first job that you're offered, because 90 days is untenable. Like 90 days is not enough to do the things that you need to do to be able to get the kind of job that you're qualified for. Because you might need to recertify, you might need to upskill, you might need to get your documents translated and your degree like you might need to learn English. You might be highly skilled, but you still need to become more proficient in English to be able to work in X, Y, or Z field that you worked on in your country. But the 90 days thing really initially is an obstacle, because it means that folks are like, well, I need to get a job because I need to pay for rent, I need to pay for food. The $1,200 is not going to cut it. And so it takes a while for people to be able to sort of save up and do what they need to do. But that 90 days, I think, is a challenge for that. And so many people end up working at the Tyson, which is in Wilkesboro, and other packaging plants and other, meat processing plants.
Omar, any thoughts or additions?
Well, I was just thinking about the gender dynamic that gets played out with this, because especially families with children, again, this is just my anecdotal observations, but it seems like the way that that's set up, it really disfavors, I'm not even sure if that's the word, women, is my experience. And then in terms of language, because then what happens is that mothers or elder females in the household end up staying in the house and not actually having the ability to develop the English communication, which is really important for getting jobs. But I don't know if that's something that you thought about it, how documented that is. But that's what I've viewed in terms of getting to know various families. What do you think about that, Diya?
Yeah, I think I'm sure there are studies about this. I think anecdotally, just in our experience, that if the people in the family who can work are really pressured, I guess, again, by the system. So the 90 days. And it can be challenging for moms, because they have to figure out, okay, well, I need to work, but childcare is not free, or pre-K is not free here. Right. What do I do with my kids? So people work different shifts. Mom working like the night shift, dad working the day shift, so that they can make it work, so that someone is at home with the kids. But I will say that, it just depends on where the family is from and culturally, what these gender dynamics are like. But in my experience, that has been that what you're saying seems to be true, that moms, oftentimes, take care of the kids, and it means that that's sort of a big focus, that if they have their own particular interests or things like that, then that has to, be on the back burner, until, kids are going to school or
Yeah.
there are some other accommodations.
And they just don't learn language as quickly because they're just not in the workforce per se. That's that's
Yeah.
an added burden, if you will.
Yeah, I do want to, and I don't know if anybody from New Arrivals is on the call. One of our really wonderful, wonderful organizations in Greensboro is New Arrivals Institute, and they are funded to support refugees up to 5 years or until they receive citizenship. And they provide weekend classes and classes to moms, and moms can bring their kids with them because there's childcare on site.
Yeah.
And so that they can learn English. So again, I think what happens in a place like Greensboro is that they identify exactly the gap that you're talking about. And they're like, well, let's build a thing for that.
Yeah.
Right? Let's build a system that support, you know, and I think that's one of the things that I find so heartening about Greensboro is that, you know, the refugee community itself is trying to figure out how do we address some of these gaps that we experienced when we came.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you for both of you for answering that. I have a couple more questions before we get to any audience Q&A, so I'll move to that. And Omar, I'll start with you for this one. Why is it important to share and understand these stories, and how might these stories shape the ways in which we live and relate to one another?
I mean, I think it makes us more human. I think it also probably protects people from different kinds of discrimination that happen here that can look a whole range of ways. And I think that it's a way for us to, in some ways, really grow as people, and the culture here that I think it feeds on itself. There's a sort of a positive feedback loop in that we're creating that people that may not have been exposed to different languages, people carry that over in terms of them teaching their children. And so I think that there's something about cultivating an environment where people are seen as fellow human beings. It's not a small thing. I mean, the dehumanization of refugees is very deliberate and used in an exploitative way by politicians to curry, you know, to get votes. And so in some ways, the work that we're doing here is an attempt also to an antidote to that kind of different kind of violence that is directed towards refugees. So I think it's about being able to create spaces. And, you know, we're also a college city that we have multiple colleges on campus. And I think that adds to the kind of environment that is welcoming for refugees. There's more work as we can do to kind of make those campuses sites, and there are some challenges with public dollars coming in, but Diya does oftentimes, she speaks about like the ways that one can navigate this, you know. So for those of you who have any university connections, follow up with Diya, because she's very creative around ways of kind of making this happen, because she's seen it around the country.
Thank you. Thank you. So Diya, I'll ask the same question to you. Why was it important to share and capture and understand these stories? And you touched on it a little bit in the beginning, but maybe the second part of the question, how might these stories shape the ways in which we live and relate to one another?
Yeah, and I think Ahmad is right on. The refugees, people on the move have gotten a really bad rap, right? I mean, in the news, in the media, we see them in masses, right? They're not individuated, they're not individuals, they're not a person who has a very particular story and a very particular background and a particular reason for moving. So it's really easy to sort of dismiss and to vilify people that you don't see, right? People that you can't individually identify. And it's not that people are ill-meaning. I completely agree with Omar that the strong men are ill-meaning, right? Like they don't, it's malignant. Like the narrative and the discourse around refugees is intentionally there, as he said, to create a sense of fear. And I'm going to protect you, right? If you elect me, I'm going to protect you from this wave of people who are coming at us. So it's really important to sort of combat that narrative. And to share those stories from people that you trust, right? So this book is an example of that, but it should not be just that. We should be talking to each other, and people do, finding ways to, talk to family members or friends, because if somebody trusts you and you tell them a personal story, they will listen to you. And so the more we can hear about the individuals, about the people, from people we trust, the more we unlearn some of those things that people want us to believe. And it's so easy for us to believe because there's no other narratives. There are no alternative narratives. Like, we're constantly bombarded by those really damaging or negative, discourses about refugees. And so I want to give an example, because I think this is such a beautiful way that every campus of refuge manifests itself. So one of the ways that I see this operating on college and university campuses is that, first of all, students who I think of students as like the perfect affinity group to work with refugees, because like refugees, they are newcomers. They are coming to a campus and they're trying to figure out, where is my community? What is this place? What is my way here, right? This is the UNCG logo. Is it find your way here? Where is the way? How do I navigate this? So students get that. They get that we're trying to figure out who we are in this new place. Who is our community? How can we find our way here? And that deep kind of empathy and compassion that a student has to a newcomer, I see it and I feel it all the time, which is why students who participate develop long-term relationships with the families that they support. But the other thing that I see is that when a university hosts a refugee family, everybody is really involved. It's not just the students, but also the facilities who have to show up to the house if the dishwasher breaks down, for example, which happens every once in a while. And the people who show up from facilities, they're the folks who are from North Carolina. They, other than this, might not really have an opportunity to engage with a refugee family. And it's remarkable to me to see how it's transformative for both groups to meet each other, right? Like someone who was born and raised in North Carolina, there might not be another way in which they might have encountered and connected with a refugee family. So just the example of this really wonderful person we have at Guilford, who is in our facilities, and now visits with the family and brings toys to the girl in the family and just connects with the family. This is such a great way to build relationships organically that otherwise would not have been possible. And so I think the more we can actually have tea with each other, connect to each other, share a meal, the better we are as a community, the more we understand why it is that we have to welcome and we should be welcoming.
I really love this last point that you raised, which is that I just think that there are these champions in the community who don't have official titles. I'm thinking about actually one of my close neighbors, Connie Tyre, who is just an incredible champion of people, but has really done the work of connecting families with others, and she doesn't necessarily have some title, and so people can participate. If you know somebody who's a refugee, you can befriend them, and again, not to extract information, but to use your linguistic abilities to be of help, to offer a connection, to give them a ride. A lot of what the new people who are coming here, newcomers, don't have is transportation. So it's very basic stuff that people need. And so we can offer that to each other in very simple ways. And you don't necessarily have to go through organizations, because some people would like to just be able to do it on their own. And I think that that's fine as well. But I think showing that care of inviting people to your house, offering them tea, sharing that, I think is very, very important grounding for everybody, actually, for everybody.
Yeah, that is beautifully said. Thank you, Omar. That's wonderful. So I'll wrap up with one of my questions before we turn over to our audience questions. So if you've been sitting on a question and you are thinking about asking it, please put that in the chat or Q&A, because they'll be ready to answer those for you. But Omar and Diya, is there anything that you are currently working on or work that you're involved with? Diya, you've mentioned eCar, that you would like to share with the audience. Tell them what you're up to. So we'll start with maybe Omar first and then Diya. Oh, and muted.
I'm so sorry. My efforts are quite modest. I mean, I'm the dean of the honors college. It's called Lloyd International Honors College, and it was founded by somebody who knew the importance of having a global perspective. She was in the military and Navy officer, and she wanted to give back, so she helped to endow the college, and so students get a stipend to study abroad. And so one of the things that we've been trying to do is very intentionally create spaces and stages for folks to share their stories to the extent that they feel comfortable. But learning how to articulate their stories is also really important, and looking for scholarship opportunities. And so I work that side of things, and then but I think as meaningful and as impactful is befriending several families and really learning, but offering what we have here to give. And it's again, little things like helping, the high school kid to better articulate and read English. Like little things that we can do have a real impact, can be very empowering, or just to give them your cell number or WhatsApp or some contact so people know, oh, I can call this person. There's a feeling of like probably security there. So those are small things. I mean, Diya is doing the heavy lift of really trying to organize, not just locally, but really nationally, and inspire. So Diya, please.
Thank you, Omar. You are very modest. I remember when I first heard about the Chevalier, I was like, I mean, really, that's just, you are doing incredible work. You're basically been knighted. So it's, yeah, so every campus of refuge is ongoing. If you're on the call and you're connected to a college or university, I hope you ask a question about how your college and university can participate in this work. I'd love to answer that question so that others can hear. What we're working on right now is an oral history of resettlement campuses. So I just want to use that term and define it very quickly. A resettlement campus is a college or university that acts as a site for resettlement. It acts as a place where newcomers experience resettlement and integration. So really ECAR chapters and other universities that have been doing this work. And so this oral history is a way for us to tell the story from the newcomer perspective. What was it like to arrive on a campus and be on campus? What was it like the first few days? So we just want to document that history from the newcomer perspective. What's really exciting about this oral history project is that the oral histories are being collected by former refugees who have also been hosted and supported by colleges and universities. I'm excited about the way that we're working on this. There's an advisory group that also contains newcomers, but also resettlement agency staff, students, folks from the various stakeholders, right? So that we can collectively come to an understanding of what does it mean to try to document this story and to try to share the story in a way that catalyzes and accelerates the creation of more opportunities like this across higher education. And so the end result, we hope, at the end of this year will be a way for us to share these stories in really compelling forms, maybe even animations or short videos or things like that are creative, so that we can utilize them in different spaces, whether it's in a training or a webinar or on a website or in a conversation or in a brief presentation that you have with the president for like 5 minutes. And here's a 30-second thing that you can say or show about what it means for newcomers to be supported in this way and what it means for us, for the community to be involved.
Well, fantastic. Thank you, Diya and Omar, for sharing out what you're working on so everyone can kind of be on the lookout for that. And I'm going to call on my colleague, Melanie. I think we have maybe a few audience questions, so I'd love to get to those. Melanie, do we have some questions from the audience?
We do. Thank you, Melissa. And thank you to Diya and Omar so much for sharing your thoughts and perspectives and stories with us this evening. I think that you've both really done a beautiful job of breaking down some barriers of understanding and really kind of helping me personally to understand that, just giving my phone number to somebody could be really impactful, and just kind of connecting in those ways that might seem simple, but are really, really impactful and important. So again, thank you both for your conversation tonight. If you do have a question, please do add it in the chat or the Q&A, and we'll try to get to as many as we can this evening. Our first question is for you, Omar. This person is asking if you could talk a little bit about your work and how it, and I know that you've talked a little bit about it, but just maybe tell us a little bit more in depth about some of the things that you work on and how it intersects or relates or overlaps with the mission of ICAR and Diya's book.
Well, I look at the history of Africans and people of African descent moving into different parts of the world, and I think I was inspired by my father's story. Now, my father came to the United States in 1959 on a Fulbright scholarship, but he came. Actually, he was applying to engineering schools, and he looked at a map and he said, "Okay, well, where should I go?" And he figured if you go to the southern part of the United States, it's warmer. He's from India, and he's like, "Oh, well, that's probably better than to be in some cold weather." So he decided to go to Georgia Institute of Technology instead of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology for that reason. And he arrived in the middle of the civil rights movement. And I think his stories of what he experienced as a darker-skinned South Asian in the space where Black people were sometimes phenotypically lighter skinned than he was, but being discriminated in ways that he didn't experience as a foreigner, got me thinking about race and immigration, migration, forced migration. And so I think this is something that has been in my mind. My mother came from Peru. And so I think of the movement of people and the ways in which some people do it on their own volition, others don't. And I'm very concerned about, just the plight of ongoing forced migrations and refugees around the world. So that's a little bit about what I do as a scholar. And I think for me, it was instilled by my parents the importance of education to kind of stabilize and to uplift. And so I try to offer that. And so I'm in the privileged position as a dean at a local university where I can be very intentional to support students in those journeys. So I try to use that space to help students move along, and not just students in my college, but in terms of all students on our campus as a faculty advisor for multiple organizations. So those are some of the things that I do. Stop there. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that, Omar. We really appreciate that. And again, thank you for being here this evening. We have a couple other questions. One question in particular is from an App State student. Thank you for being here to all of our students. This audience member says, I'm an App State student and Greensboro native. How do you believe the American culture surrounding immigration has changed over time? And how can the nation become more effective and improve the experience of new immigrants, such as the efforts of those being done in Greensboro? And I invite Diya or Omar to start off.
Diya.
Yeah, that's a big question. How do we believe American culture surrounding immigration has changed over time? I think there's been, well, let me just say that one of the things that I've noted just in the refugee resettlement history, that 1981, for example, when we started the refugee resettlement program here as a formal program in 1980, 1981 was the highest admissions number since the start of the program, so 1981. The other high numbers were under the Reagan administration and the Obama administration. And so it's not always true to say that it depends on who the president, sometimes it's a Republican, sometimes, but I will say that over the years, over the last few years, there has been increased fear of, migration because of geopolitically what's happening and the need to reframe our intervention in that, and to, talk about how we are being threatened rather than how what we're doing as a country might actually facilitate the displacement and does facilitate the displacement of people around the world. So I'm not sure how to answer that question. To me, it's pretty broad. I will say that just from my own experience is that there has been times when it has been better for refugees to come to the United States, the systems, just the number of people that we've admitted. But I will say that the way that the community has supported refugees has increased, in my experience, over the years, and that has empowered newcomers to integrate rather than assimilate. So, for example, when I talk to refugees who came here as children 20 or 30 years ago, they talk about how their parents would say, don't speak our language in school. Like, just, try to fit in. Don't, tell people that you're Muslim. Don't, just, there's a kind of the sense that we want to fit in as much as possible. And my experience now is that people are feeling here, at least in Greensboro, more empowered to really stick to their culture, to their traditions, to their practices, to speak their languages, to say, where they're from and who they are and what, traditions they practice. So I'm not sure that I can answer that question fully, but I will say that, it's just sort of depended on the period, it depended on the policies, what president it was in at the time, but that there's also a movement towards, I think, greater empowerment around identity for newcomers.
Mm-hmm. And that also can change, right? And we're seeing sort of, in some ways, I would call it almost attacks on issues around issues of diversity and inclusion. And I think that creates a climate that can reverse things. So I think for me, that question is, it doesn't happen just sort of on its own. We help to create that. And that's why I think it's important that we have this beautiful space in Greensboro to cultivate that kind of in sort of openness. But I think that wherever you are, because there are people on this call that are from different parts of the state, and I think even other parts of the country, I think, right, that you in some ways connect with the people locally to do the kind of work to try to create those open spaces, because there's the political climate can shift, and so it's important to know. Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. Melanie, do we have some more questions?
We do, and continue to put those in the chat. We have about 10 more minutes together. Diya, this question is for you, and Omar, I welcome you to share your thoughts as well. Do children born of refugees in the guest country automatically get citizenship? We've thought that maybe that might be the case in the United States, but does that happen in other countries?
If you are born in the United States, you receive U.S. citizenship. Very few countries around the world have that law, which is that if you're born in that country, you receive citizenship. I think, in fact, the majority of countries don't provide citizenship to someone who's born there unless their parent is a citizen of that country. And in some countries, you have to be the father. So sometimes the citizenship goes through the father's line, not the mother's line. So I'm Jordanian. I have Jordanian citizenship, but my husband does not. And so my daughters will not receive Jordanian citizenship.
Omar, do you have any thoughts that you want to express on that as well?
No.
Thank you. Diya, maybe this is another question for you as well. We have an audience member who is asking, what psychological support is available for refugees who have undergone trauma? A very important question.
Omar, did you want to?
No, I was waiting for you to respond.
Yeah.
I'm ready to jump in. Yeah,
absolutely. The mental health piece is crucial.
Yeah.
And I think it's one of the areas in which people are understanding nationally, not just for refugees. We need to be doing a better job in attending to mental well-being and mental health. So as far as I know, the Refugee Resettlement Program does not have official programming around mental health support. But what I've seen emerge in the community and the infrastructure is different ways in which people can access mental health support through community-driven and culturally responsive efforts. So for example, in Greensboro, we have Emoja, which is a group that was founded at the CNNC. It's a group of women from the DRC who are there for each other and meet with each other and talk to each other. We see that happen too in other places where like women groups or other support groups form because of that need for mental well-being.
Yeah.
And I mean, mental health, as you know, probably, the idea of it is stigmatized, like receiving counseling that is directly, you know, identifying you as someone who needs mental health support can be highly stigmatized. And especially if you need interpretation and translation, sometimes communities are so small, like you get an interpreter, and what if that interpreter knows your family, right? It's
Right.
just, you know, it's a fraught space.
Yeah. I really appreciate the question. I was thinking about the Stuart Brown, who is psychologist, educator, talked about how the opposite of play is not work, it's depression. And how when you have these support groups, it's sometimes it takes the form of people expressing themselves, and I think it's important for people to express themselves and where they're emotionally. But culturally, people have difficulties doing that in different parts of the world, including the United States. And so, but I think it's the creating of things together, whether it's like going on walks together, or weaving together, or cooking together. These are forms of adult play, if you will. And I think that our human activity of those kinds, creating stuff, whether it's a meal together, a basket, a walk, a song, those things are actually directly impactful in a positive way in terms of our mental health. And I say this, this is not for the people who are engaged in this work. It's not charity work. It's actually really therapeutic for them, those people who are actually reaching out to refugees and doing this, because my experience, this personally, is that it's deeply therapeutic, grounding, and growthful for me. And maybe it's selfish to put it that way, but I think that it's because creating stuff together with people, including creating conversations, is growthful for us. So I think that mental health care takes the form of talking to a therapist, but it also takes a form of playing in different ways, as we do as adults, and we can follow the lead of children in this way more.
If I can just say, so recently we conducted, under the leadership of Dr. Catherine Bennett, an evaluation of 6 ECAR chapters. So these are national, and some of them have been around for a while, some of them are new. Wake Forest is one of them, Guilford is another from the North Carolina space. And it included focus groups and surveys of folks who did not come as newcomers, but were participating in the program as volunteers and faculty and staff. And community members, and then also folks who were hosted. So they're refugees and non-refugees. And it was really interesting that in one of the survey questions, they're asked to identify what are the top things that they believe participating in a program like this has provided. And not surprisingly, the non-refugees, the top things were housing, like free housing, support with transportation, things like that. The number one thing that was selected by refugees was mental health, which was interesting because ECAR chapters don't set out to provide mental health support. But it's obvious that when people receive support in other ways, right, whether it's relationships or financial support or friendship or help with figuring out how to use the bus, that all equates to well-being because you're not stressed out about X, Y, or Z, right? So that was really interesting to see that.
That is, thank you. That's an excellent question. And I think as we wind down kind of our time here, Melanie, we've probably got time for one more question. And I think I've seen some questions about ECAR. Melanie, if you want to maybe combine those together.
I couldn't have set it up better myself. Yeah, folks want to get involved. We have a couple of questions about how they can follow up with ECAR and join the effort and maybe even bring it to their local campus.
That's wonderful. I love to hear it. So our website, I'm going to put it in the chat, is everycampusarefuge.net. And I will also put my email in the chat so that you can reach out. What's really great about the way we've set it up is that there's really a lot of resources to help you from every point in your journey, just kind of casual interest to you're doing the thing and then afterwards. So there's a manual that you can follow. It's called the Ahlan Manual, a manual for establishing resettlement campuses together. So it's a community-driven, infrastructure building of resettlement campuses, and it's a toolkit and a guide for how to do that. And then there's a best practices manual for when you actually do it, and a program coordinator handbook. So we have a lot of resources, including trainings and things like that are available, free, open access. ICAR is ready, and my team is ready to really support you. We all work in higher education, and so we understand, we know what kind of pain points there are, what kind of hesitancies you might face, what kind of opportunities are you might also encounter. So check out our website for all the resources that are there, and then please feel free to email me we can set up a time to talk about what getting this on your campus could look like.
Mhm.
Excellent, very good. And Omar, if you want to put your contact information there as well, if folks want to reach out to you to have more conversations, we'd welcome you to share that as well if you're comfortable with that. But I want to take the time to thank Diya and Omar for their conversation this evening and for sharing their perspectives and their stories and sharing stories of the refugees highlighted in American Refuge. I want to thank our wonderful audience for attending and for asking such great questions. We really do appreciate your time and your engagement. After the conclusion of this event, those of you who registered with an email address will receive a brief survey to complete. We would greatly appreciate you completing this survey to hear your feedback on this program. Please visit our website at www.nchumanities.org to learn more about other upcoming events and to subscribe to our email newsletter to stay up to date with all NC Humanities news and programs. And Diya, of course, put the ICAR website in there. We would encourage you to visit that as well to learn more about her work with ICAR. So our next North Carolina Reads virtual book conversation will be on Wednesday, May 29th, 2024 at 6:00 p.m. on Zoom webinar. We will meet to discuss our May selection, The Violin Conspiracy, with author Brendan Slocum and Dr. Marcus Pyle in a conversation moderated by Rebecca Godwin. Thank you everyone again for attending this evening. Thank you, Diya, and thank you, Omar, and I hope you all have a wonderful evening. Thank you.